Do you want to know how to EQ your podcast? You're in the right place. I'm Jason Sanderson from podcasttech.com, where we take the hard work out of your podcasting. Come for the podcast production advice, stick around for the terrible toilet humour. This is the brown frequency. If you're new to podcasting, there's a good chance your production starts and ends with recording it, throwing some kind of leveling processor on it, and then boom, you're done. If you've encountered EQ at all in the podcasting world, it's probably with some basic filtering options on the mic itself, like a high-pass filter, which is usually described by most companies as a way of removing low-level rumble. What it's actually doing is taking away the lower frequencies, ideally all the ones below our vocal range, and hopefully removing useless parts of the sonic spectrum, making for a much more efficient use of the recording headroom. I've seen it posted somewhere that high-pass filtering will fix things like knocking and bumping into the microphone, like this. Which it won't, it'll just cut the lower frequencies and leave behind the distortions and noise in the upper frequencies, so we'd have to use different tools to fix that kind of thing. So proper mic positioning is important, and if you want to know more about mic positioning, I've done another video, you can go check that out. Maybe it's here, maybe it's there. But for the most part, rolling off those low frequencies can really help solve a bunch of those problems in your dialogue work. Some modern USB mics have filters and EQ options built into the app, like the new Shure MV7, which is a new digital take on the classic SM7B. Here you can see EQ options. We've got flat, which is just normal, untreated, and we've got a high-pass filter. Then we've got what it calls a presence boost, which is a bump in the higher frequencies. And then we've also got an option for high-pass filtering and the presence boost. So you can see there's a few different EQ options here inside of the app for the microphone. But what happens if we want to go further than just a simple filter? What happens with multiple voices that sound drastically different from one another and we need to try and match them? What happens if the sound of the guest's voices sounds like a cheese grater against your eardrums? Maybe Barry White is back with his baritone voice sounding
deeper and far sexier than you.
But first, what is EQ? Short for equalization, it's doing just that. It's a tool for equalizing and balancing the sonic spectrum. A quick bit of science here. I'm going to try and be a little bit like Bill Nye, the science guy. Every sound can be split up into frequencies measured in hertz, which is oscillations in cycles per second, mostly collectively bumping together, phasing and shaping each other to form some sort of audio soup that vibrates our eardrums, that then does its best to relay that information to our brain. Human hearing, for most of us, starts off with an ability to register as low as 20 Hz and as high as 20,000 Hz, or 20 kHz as it's also noted. That window narrows as we grow older or suffer from hearing damage. It's quite common to reach middle age and not hear much above 14,000 Hz. Other species have different hearing ranges, which is why dogs hear dog whistles and we can't. That frequency is beyond our hearing.
Give me a keg of beer.
Except for Michael J. Fox, who it annoys the crap out of. Enough with the science, back to reality. So ideally we want to filter the frequencies that are lower than the lowest fundamental frequency of the human voice, avoiding wasted energy in the recorded representation of it, while also enhancing frequencies we feel that it's missing, and also subtracting ones that don't even fit within the vocal frequency range. In doing so, we'll get a much louder, more present master file for our podcast. So what are all the other EQ options? As a real-world example, a bit easier to understand, but probably lost on some younger people, you can think of it like on a typical hi-fi stereo, where there's a bass adjustment for adding that booty-shaking club sound, or some way of adjusting the brightness for clarity, all in an attempt to make what we're listening to sound much more pleasing. And that's the goal with EQ. It's a tool to make what we're working on much more pleasing to the listener, adding in frequencies that we feel like it's missing, and taking away those dominating frequencies that ruin the listenability, while forcing the audio to fit a better technical specification that will replay on most people's listening equipment and be reproduced in the same pleasing way for the majority of listeners overall. In the same way that we like to amplify the nicer parts of the sound, we can use EQ to notch out the noises and specific resonances that we don't like, but for now, let's just go into how I EQ a podcast. Here I am inside of Pro Tools using the basic stock EQ plugin that comes free with Pro Tools. You can use any EQ plugin as long as you can freely adjust the bandwidth, frequency, and gain. And ideally, like in this example, we're using a 5-band EQ. Something that's always talked about with mastering engineers is this idea that you fix the low end first, sort any issues that you have in the low end, and then move further up the frequency spectrum as you're sorting things out. The idea being, once the bass frequencies are sorted, the majority of the rest of it should fall into line okay. What I like to do is I like to boost some of this low end frequencies, moving the frequency band around so I can hear where it's resonating. You should be able to hear it making this woo, woo, woo. Especially if you've got headphones on or if you've got some speakers that are bigger than, say, a normal phone or a laptop speaker, something that's got some ability to kick out some bass. And it's usually around the fundamental, what we mentioned earlier. So let's just sweep this around and try and find the frequency that we want.
Just not currently capable of helping the people who need her, especially people as deserving of help as military families. And if you need some extra...
For me, it's round about there. So we boosted it, found the problem, and then we're going to reduce it. And usually a little bit higher up in the lower mids, you'll be able to find another similar kind of problem. It's more like a boxy honkiness, like a honk, rather than a woo.
Even compromise their career. But then you also have to uphold your ethical obligation to your patients. So what do? We wanted to...
So can you hear that, how it's extending way past the actual spoken word? There's a resonant frequency that's happening. His word stops and the resonance carries on. And so now that we've found that frequency, we can pull that back. Then look, what I like to do is find a similar thing in the higher mid frequencies. So somewhere around here in the 3 to 4K area, we're going to find some kind of like a whistle. It's going to also extend past when the voice stops, it'll ring on after. Some kind of...
Then, later in the impairment of colleagues section, apparently they've thought about this already, it says, social workers who have direct knowledge of a social work...
So for me, it's round about there. Can you hear how it's going... So again, when we've found this problem, we're going to reduce by an adequate amount.
That is a really tough situation. It's got to be incredibly hard when a colleague is suffering and you have to...
I usually find at this frequency that it's much more natural to have the bandwidth a little bit wider. So we don't want the Q bandwidth pulling in tight like on the other examples. It sounds much smoother and more natural. Then over here, there's a very similar thing with a high pitch ringing, which I like to think of this one as being more like a itchy. It feels like inside of my head's itchy. You know, it's really high pitched and so much higher than the whistle that we had before.
Colleagues' impairment that is due to personal problems, psychosocial distress, substance abuse, or mental health difficulties, and that interferes with practice effectiveness, should consult with that colleague when...
So for me, it's round about there. Then we'll subtract that frequency a little bit. So then what I like to do is boost the mid frequency, so something that's going to be quite dominant in the natural vocal range, and it's usually between 800 hertz and 1 kilohertz. This is going to add some natural thickness back to it. Usually if we take away something, we've got to add something back in. So now you'll hear it's much more thick and present. Let's give it a listen.
Or she admits that she's struggling but doesn't take any steps to get better, then I think you have to escalate this. And by the way, having this conversation with your colleague first, that's important for several reasons. First of all, you're ethically obligated to do so. As Dr. Margolis explained to us, there can be significant penalties for violating ethical...
Then because I've made so many changes here, it's good to bypass back and forth and hear the kind of differences that we are actually making to the sound. Sometimes we might need to turn the output level up a little bit to match. If we're taking away frequencies, obviously we've got to boost the level back up so that it sounds the same kind of level, so that we're not hearing a difference in the overall gain structure. Remember that if something sounds louder, then it automatically sounds better. So we don't want to fool ourselves into believing what we're doing is right. We want to be sure that we're doing something constructive. So let's level match and be sure to use bypass regularly to confirm our results.
And you can share some resources and support her. But if she denies that anything is wrong, or she admits that she's struggling but doesn't take...
What we might find is that we still might need to tweak a little bit. So because we're drastically changing the lows, then that's going to drastically change the highs. The same with this middle presence boost. It's going to drastically change what's happening in the low mids and the high mids. So it's a balancing act. We need to find the right setting that's going to work all across the board. With all this woot woot, tss, tss, honking and whistles, I'm starting to feel a little bit like Thomas the Tank Engine.
Since your supervisor is already looking into it...
You hear that low frequency there?
You said you love your clients, your role in people's lives, and that role confers a great responsibility. And one way that you fulfill that responsibility is by protecting clients from an unstable or
You hear that honkiness, so we bring that down.
she's some kind of monster, but because she's just not currently capable of helping the people who need her. And the same principle applies in any profession, but all the more so in a profession that explicitly is about helping people,
We hear the thickness there.
especially people as deserving of help as military families. And if you need some extra guidance here, Dr. Margolis also mentioned that you could call your local license
You can hear that whistle there, so we're going to bring that down.
and get an ethical consultation on what to do. Or, if your agency has an in-house ethics board, you can talk to them about your situation without giving any.
And we hear the itchiness there, so we're going to bring that down. Right, so I just want to give a warning. You don't really want to be copying my settings here. These are a good starting point, but what I should warn you is that every voice is different. Every voice will need boosting of a different frequency or cutting of a different frequency, depending on what it sounds like. You can even have the same person speaking down the exact same microphone and the exact same setup the following day, and it sound completely different and have to use completely different settings. Use what I've showed you today as a template and a guide of where to start, but you're going to have to move these sliders around and find what works for that specific voice on that specific day with that specific setup. It's going to be completely different for everyone. So please, don't just use it as a set and forget. So I hope all that information helps how you treat your final masters on your podcasts when you're making them. And if you have trouble, you can always get in touch with me at podcasttech.com and we're happy to help. Please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode. And also, if you'd be kind enough to share it with a podcasting friend, maybe we can help them out on their podcast. I've been Jason Sanderson from podcasttech.com. What's been your podcasting challenges this week?